The stream is about to begin.
All right, my writeitivyright pupils. In today's video, I'm going to go over how to embed quotes. So in my teaching of this, I have 4 frames, so 4 different ways that allow and enable students to embed their quotes seamlessly. And it all pivots around a fundamental concept that I call the 5-word rule. So to get students to avoid what I call quote dumping and get those quotes to be very conversational in tone, I use these frames, and I also use the heuristic of the 5-word rule to really get these sounding nice and silky smooth. So sit in, strap up, stay tuned, and I'll walk you through it. All right, my writeitivyright pupil. So one of the glitches I see as a composition teacher of over 25 years, especially when we look at how kids infuse and embed their quotes into their writing, is that they're very abrupt and they lack a certain silky smoothness. And what I want to talk to you about is getting those conversational embedded quotes super silky smooth versus the quote dump, right? So there's a fundamental difference between quote dumping and having those embedded quotes be very conversational in nature, right? And one of the other things too that we talk about in composition a lot is the line of reasoning and the complexity. I like to teach my kids a manner of quoting that gets the quotes talking or conversating back to the thesis and the prompt. I think it's a nice little trick to help them sustain their line of reasoning and have full body paragraphs that are active and supple and really communicating and hammering home the thesis. So what I'm going to do to demonstrate this is we're going to take a look at Marge Percy's poem called Barbie Doll. And I'll read that to you in just a second if you're unfamiliar with it. And then we're going to anchor our analysis around the poem. So the other thing, and I've already alluded to this, is I'm going to thoroughly teach you and break down a concept that I call the 5-word rule that helps kids, transition into and out of their quotes with ease and a certain alacrity. So here's the poem real quick. I'm not going to spend any time dissecting it with you. I just want you to be familiar with it for context and reference. So it's called Barbie Doll by Marge Percy. The girl child was born as usual and presented dolls that did PP and miniature GE stoves and irons and wee lipsticks the color of cherry candy. Then in the magic of puberty, a classmate said, "You have a great big nose and fat legs." She was healthy, tested intelligent, possessed strong arms and back, abundant sexual drive and manual dexterity. She went to and fro apologizing. Everyone saw a fat nose on thick legs. She would advise to play coy, exhorted to come on hearty, exercise, diet, smile, and wheedle. Her good nature wore out like a fan belt. So she cut off her nose and her legs and offered them up. In the casket displayed on satin, she lay with the undertaker's cosmetics painted on. A turned-up putty nose dressed in a pink and white nightie. "Doesn't she look pretty?" everyone said. Consummation at last, to every woman a happy ending. And what I'm going to do here is show you a heuristic that I know those of you that follow my YouTube channel and are familiar with my work. To do our body paragraphs, I use a heuristic or a frame called the syllogistic method. And it comes from the Aristotelian tradition, and it basically just means this, that within one body paragraph, you have a first premise, a second premise, and a conclusion. And if you want to deep dive into that, just get into my YouTube channel. Like virtually every other video is about the syllogistic method, especially the full writing workshops. So we're not going to worry about the first premise all that much, except with this one slide here. Because the first premise is where you get anchored into your point of analysis. It's sort of like the sub-thesis of the body paragraph, or like the umbrella concept. So most students ask, where do I begin my analysis? And I like it when kids go chronologically and sequentially through a piece. So we often use a stem that begins with right from the onset. It cues the reader into knowing that you are going to be very, methodical in going through your analysis. So in the first premise, you use your terms, your devices, your techniques. You can either imply them or be explicit in how you delineate things. And the first premise always takes 3 sentences. And the reason for that is on the synthesis portion of AP Lang, the directions say your argument must be central. And I wish the College Board would say that for all 6 FRQs, the Lang and the Lit exam combined, because we are engaging in expository writing, which hence we are engaging in the active argumentation. So you got to keep your argument central, and I wouldn't start quoting until like the 4th sentence. Otherwise, you're going to be guilty of this, doing plot analysis versus literary analysis, and the task is asking us to perform literary analysis. So I think taking 3 sentences to set up the umbrella concept is plenty of space to get a centralized argument. So here is the first premise. Right from the onset, Percy normalizes the idea that a social contract is prescribed to young girls at the moment of their birth. The childlike diction reinforces the odd and presumably ludicrous rationale for the reasons as to why these scripts continue to exist and hold women back on so many levels. As such, which is clear for the protagonist who deviates from her preordained role, it stands to reason that she must alter herself in order to fit in socially and be accepted as a woman who can pass society's litmus test. So that is the first premise. And you can see in there that this writer has, some explicit, some implicit terms. We're starting up top of the poem and we're just laying the stage for our analysis. And I always tell my kids, you got to keep the promise of the first premise. So that predicates and kind of presupposes what quotes you must have in the second premise. So one of the things that we're going to do here in the second premise is just look at my 4 frames for how to quote. So this is example number 1. I'll read it and then I'll break it down for you. Almost immediately upon exiting the womb, this girl child was born as usual and presented dolls that did pee-pee, right? So let me break this down for you. You can see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 words in front of the quote. This harkens back to what I was talking about with regards to the 5-word rule. Typically, if a student uses a minimum, so not exactly, but a minimum of 5 words in front of the quote and keeps the quote relatively small, it should sound conversational and avoid the quote dumping scenario that we've, addressed previously. So this is one frame in which you just take a quote and drop it. And you'll notice that at the end of the quote, the student drops the period. So that's frame 1. So there are other ways to do this where you avoid dropping the period at the end of the sentence. So I'll show you frame number 2. My students typically say almost immediately or immediately because it harkens back to right from the onset, the first word of the first premise. So all of these are going to begin almost immediately and take a quote from on high up top of the poem. So this is a different frame to show you how to quote. So frame number 2. Almost immediately upon exiting the womb, this girl child was born as usual and presented dolls that did pee-pee and suggested that upon reaching the magical age of puberty, that she would be burdened with a great big nose and fat legs. Okay, so let's break down frame number 2. You can see here that there's more than one quote in the sentence. This is essential, I think, in terms of considering whether or not a student has complexity at sentence level. In this one, you have 3 quotes in one sentence. Usually, I advise my students to try their hand at doing this at least once per syllogism. And you can see that it's very conversational. If you were to close your eyes and just hear me read that. If you're unfamiliar with the poem, you can't even hear the quotes, right? That's what I mean by being silky smooth. But you see within this quotation here, the use of brackets. You got to teach your kids how to bastardize the poem, the language of the poem, to fit the conversational tone of their writing. So in here, I changed magic to magical, right? To keep it conversational. So that's frame number 2. Frame number 3 is going to do something a little different. And you always use the 5-word rule, right? So I'm just going to use the same stem. Almost immediately upon exiting the womb, this girl child was born as usual and presented dolls that did pee-pee that were principally preoccupied by trite concerns like applying wee lipsticks the color of cherry candy to woo and amaze the men in their lives. So a couple of things here that I'll point out. You see that the sentence does not end where the quote ends. It keeps flowing, right? So I always tell my students that repetition is the bane of the author's existence. And oftentimes when students quote, they end their sentence with the quote. Like they finish quoting and then boom, they drop the period. You can't do that every single time because that lacks complexity. And in this one too, you can see that there's a duo of quotes. Again, I think that adds great complexity to the student's writing and their adeptness with, wielding a couple of quotes at sentence level within a single sentence. You can see too that this is going to be really cool because in terms of sentence patterning, oftentimes our young, struggling, emerging writers will over rely on independent clauses and adjective clauses. So it extends the length of the sentence and makes it complex. And then you get into the sentence patterns a little bit with that. Let's take a look at the next one. It says, almost immediately upon exiting the womb, this girl child was born as usual and presented dolls that did pee-pee and wee lipsticks the color of cherry candy. So you can see in this frame, you use the ellipses. And I think this is a concept that, teachers are familiar with, but students often don't execute it well. So you can take from different parts of the poem, and you don't have to do it with, sheer fidelity and quote the whole big long line. You can chunk up the poem and take one segment, ... ellipses, connect it to another segment of the poem. And again, my students need to explicitly see me doing that. And I often, do a lot of Bob Rossing with my instruction, and I air quote paint with and for my students. I get to the proverbial easel and canvas, and I write right before their eyes to demonstrate how to do this. So my students come exam time are pretty good if they've given me an iota of attention with their quote transitions. And those are just 4 frames that I use to fuse in my quotes so that they sound conversational and silky smooth. All right, we are at the end. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, you can give me an email at writeitivyright@gmail.com. Also note that I have a tutoring business called writeitivyright. I principally help kids with their college personal statements, but I've also been teaching AP Lang and AP Lit for pushing 25 years. So I do a lot of tutoring for both of those subjects as well. So if you're a parent or a student watching this and you want a little extra help with your college personal statement, I'm pretty expert in that. In 25 years, in some capacity or other, I've either worked college admissions or have run my boutique or have tutored with some pretty elite tutoring boutiques. I myself am Ivy League educated, so I know how to get into the tough places. So that's it for now. I'll see you in a little while, and I hope that helps you out as far as embedding your quotes goes.